Good morning. This is Sarwar Kashmeri at Polaris-Live. I'm sorry we've had some technical difficulties, but without further ado, let me introduce my guest today on Polaris-Live, Mr. Marc Chandler. Mr. Chandler is the Chief Market Strategist at Bannockburn Global FX. He spent a career analyzing, writing, and speaking about the foreign exchange market. Mr. Chandler has written two books, Making Sense of the Dollar and Political Economy of Tomorrow. His perspective is unique because it's informed not just by finance and economics, but by history, politics, as well as economics itself. He's often picked up by the business press, and Chandler appears frequently on CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox TV. I have known Marc for well over a decade, and there's not one time that I've talked with him that I have not learned something new. Without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Marc Chandler.
Thank you,
Marc,
Sarwar.
how are you?
Nice.
I'm
Good.
very
Thank
sorry that all of these crazy technical issues happened, but we are on top of it. So here we go. And thank you again for coming here and sharing this wonderful time with us. So, if you don't mind, I'm just going to dive right into it because we already have a fairly good audience standing around. And I want to pick this topic that's on top of most money managers' minds that I've talked, right? This whole idea that China is increasingly trading in the yuan and this new $69 billion deal with Iran, the trade with Russia. What does this mean for the dollar? You know more about it than most people. Go ahead, Marc.
Sure. I don't know if I know more about it. I just have been thinking about it for a long time. And I wish I had a nickel for every time I read a piece that said the dollar was going to be replaced. Early in my career, it was going to be the Japanese yen. And then the euro was launched. It was going to be the euro. And now this group, there's people who think that the U.S. is constantly being chased and our leadership is constantly being challenged. Now says it's China. Here's ultimately what I think happens. The reason the dollar's role as a reserve currency is not just about the things that we have in our pockets. In fact, the coins and notes in circulation are a very small part of U.S. money supply. What ultimately stands behind the dollar as a reserve currency is the biggest, deepest, most liquid bond market in the world. And I would admit that there is some inertia. You and I both use the same keyboard, QWERTY. And I know that there are better, more ergonomically designed keyboards, but we're not going to adopt that because it's only marginally better. And the same thing for the dollar. If the dollar is going to be dethroned as not just the reserve currency, but remember when China buys iron ore from Australia, they trade it, invoice it in US dollars.
Right.
When China gives loans to emerging market countries for that Belt Road Initiative, those loans are often converted into dollars. The Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank that China launched a few years ago, the seed money for it, the quotas were paid in U.S. dollars. So I think that the dollar's role is relatively safe as a numeraire for the world economy. And again, if you're going to switch from U.S. dollars to say German bunds or to Japanese bonds, a reserve manager like private sector investors will give up some transparency, they'll give up some liquidity, and possibly even some security. As we sit here today, there's like $16.5 trillion of negative yielding bonds. The U.S. does not have a negative yielding bond. And I think that's an important part of what's going on globally.
Right. Well, this whole thing just takes us back to this issue, Marc. I believe that we seem to be set in the United States on this policy of decoupling. We're saying we've got to stop China. I mean, they're the greatest threat to the world, and all of this. And that bothers me because one doesn't hear any differing voices. It's as though the elite and the Washington consensus on both sides is that we've got to stop China. Do you feel the same way? And I just think it's really dangerous.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, I think that we are on this, I think as Kissinger said, we're on the foothills of a Cold War. I think that might be maybe not strong enough. I think we're well into it, and part of what that means is that U.S.
Really?
agencies like USAID, which typically helps developing countries for food security,
Right.
is now going to be like corralled, if you will, into an effort to try to help facilitate loans to developing countries so they don't buy Chinese hardware for the 5G. Even though the U.S. does not have a replacement for Huawei, these emerging market countries would have to go elsewhere, like the U.S. does, like to Europe most likely, and so I do think we're on the foothills of the Cold War, or maybe
Hey,
even further along into it.
let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you. That phrase "Cold War," it kind of my ears pricked up on that, right? Because we're all used to Cold War, Russia. But you know, Mark, the best year of trade with Russia, right? We do in one day. The U.S. does in one day
Yeah,
with China, right? I mean, China is the world's largest market for aviation, for automobiles, for iPhones, for luxury goods. I was reading the annual report that the chair CEO of Daimler-Benz made, right, about 3 weeks ago, and he said much of the investment now will go to China, not to Germany or European countries or the U.S. So my point is that for the first time we have a country, right, that is the size of the United States, eyeball to eyeball. So don't you think it's a little crazy to say, hey, we're going to stop them, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, there's a Cold War? Isn't it ridiculous?
well, I think that yeah, I mean, I'm not crazy about it, and I do worry that Cold Wars can lead to shooting wars. I do think that regardless of what happens in a couple of weeks when the U.S. has the election, that the elites in the U.S. seem very united, like you say, and I think that of course as partisans we want to say that there's a big difference between the candidates, but I think when it comes to China, we're going to find that there's not such a big difference. That the U.S. under say a Biden administration is going to be just as confrontational to China. And remember, the criticism that the Democrats have, the Democrat leadership has about Trump's policy towards China is not that it's too hard. It's not that he is sort of pushing toward this Cold War and decoupling. Their criticism is that the policy has not been effective. That is, the
Right,
U.S. has a larger trade deficit with China than Trump would have led us to believe that these tariffs would have created. So
right.
I do think that we, as Americans, but also citizens of the world, should be prepared mentally, emotionally for a growing confrontation. I think that's going to happen, even though people like yourself and myself might not think it's the best course of action. I think that's the most likely course.
But do you think confrontation means what is taking place now? I mean, superpowers always will have competition, right? But when you think about China, I don't, unless you correct me on this, I don't see them wanting to push their ideology around the world. I don't see them wanting to be the hegemon of the world. So surely, if that is correct, and I believe it is, then there is space between the attitudes that we've adopted now. And may I submit to you, see what you think, that this pandemic is kind of acting as a leveler of the playing field. I mean, there isn't any country that's not been impacted by that. And surely we can find some way. I mean, I was reading the other day that, almost 1,000 Chinese scientists are working with US scientists, right? The Shanghai real estate developers put $100 million into Harvard to look at how the two countries can work together. The Belt and Road Initiative is creating infrastructure. I mean, can't we find a way that space do what we have to do rather than adopt these crazy kill the other guy perspective?
Yeah, I think that of course, even during the original Cold War, there was the non-aligned movement that didn't want to like take sides. But I think increasingly, countries are going to have to decide. For example, what kind of 5G equipment are they going to have?
Right.
That's going to be important. What do they do to, and the U.S. isn't the only one. I think about like India taking off something over 100 Chinese apps.
Correct.
So I think that I think that to your point, it's different than the first Cold War. China is not Russia, Soviet Union, and it's not a large Japan.
Right.
So I think the confrontation will take place on many different levels. And I think you're right. There are going to be some areas for cooperation. But I think in every area of cooperation, every issue. I mean, consider this: the UN Human Rights Commission. There's some talk that India's Prime Minister Modi may seek a free trade agreement with Taiwan.
Right.
As you know, it's not just China that recognizes Taiwan as a breakaway province. The U.S. also has a one China policy since 1978.
Yes.
And I think that is being called into question. I think that there's a move in Congress to have a mutual defense pact with Taiwan, to have a trade agreement with Taiwan. And it's basically to renege on this one China policy. The U.S. is softening it. And I think this is a red line that maybe you're right, that the communist ideology really was never really spread because people, even young people, adopted it. It was really spread at gunpoint, wars. And I think that it's not about an ideological challenge. I think the challenge is just real. What country, what companies are going to dominate the 21st century? And the U.S. is trying to make sure it's its.
But let me, at the risk of tangenting a bit, to push back in one area. I think it's a misconception to call China a communist country 100%, right? Because it's a mixture of raw capitalism. I mean, the first 7 months of this year, Mark, you probably know this better than I do. I mean, 37 billionaires were created in China, right? And their total net worth is greater than that of Russia. So, I mean, this is a very weird mixture of authoritarianism, dictatorship, but raw capitalism. But my point is that China, from everything I've researched for my book at this point, is the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I've been led to believe through research and talking with experts that the U.S. Navy, its large atomic aircraft carriers, cannot now operate within 1,000 kilometers of the Chinese coastline, right? So, I mean, if those are the fundamentals of how this new policy towards China is to be built, then I think there are some real issues in plotting grand strategy. And in the time remaining, how about you, Mark, giving us an idea of what you think is the biggest issue for U.S. policy towards China in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think that in some ways we're struggling with the same thing that our parents and our grandparents did in trying to make room. I mean, think what's happening in the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. It was going to be who was going to succeed the UK. The US and Germany had already rapidly developed and had surpassed by many measures the UK.
Yes.
And I think that the question, and it's still in some ways the question, is how did the world make room for Germany? And now the question, I think, for our generation is how do we make room at the economic table, at the political table for China? Do we have to have a war to decide these things?
Right.
And I hope not. But I think this is really the question: is can there be room at the table for two giant powers? And I think that that's going to force other countries to group together. I think this is a glue that's keeping Europe, and one of the glues that are holding Europe together. I think it's going to be a glue that holds other countries and other regions try to be bigger blocks, if you will. So I think that's really the challenge for us. Can we integrate China? And right now, that the most of the tension with the integration is taking place over the goods and services, even though a lot of U.S. companies service Chinese demand by building locally, selling locally.
Exactly.
Like McDonald's, Domino's, Nike, GM. And so I think that the focus is on trade, but I think that the real thing that's happening is an integration of China in the global capital markets, something Russia, Soviet Union was never really integrated in, something that the Middle East is still not fully integrated in.
So,
I think
Mark,
that's a big challenge.
I'm interrupting again, but tell our listeners, viewers, one signal that you would get that China is really intent on integrating with the world. What might be one thing that you will watch for on the capital market? Right.
Yeah, sure. What's happening now is China is running a large trade surplus, so that's money coming into the country. They are also becoming integrated in the global bond and stock markets because their indexes are being included in the global benchmarks like MSCI. And so what this is doing is creating a lot of inflows of capital into China.
Right.
And I think the key thing to focus on is how much will China allow the currency to appreciate?
You mean
And
beyond the band that they've set right now that they regulate it in?
well, what happens is the People's Bank of China sets a reference rate for the dollar RMB exchange rate every day. It's allowed to move 2% in that band. And it has allowed the currency to appreciate recently. And it's a question of how much more are they going to tolerate? And is that going to be enough to release this pressure? Because you've got all this capital coming into the country. They got capital controls to limit the outflow.
Right.
And so I think the pressure is building, and it's got to go into the currency or something else. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is partly a way to export capital.
Exactly.
And so that can help offset it. But as you know, the foreign direct investment is really much smaller than these portfolio flows. But let me ask you, though, I know that you are you wrote your book about the BRI, and
Yes.
tell me like where you think we stand now with it, and what's the next, what should like Americans do about it? Should we just embrace it? What about these emerging markets and their loans? What do you think about it now? I think it's about a year or so after your books come out.
Gee, I wish you hadn't asked that question. I thought I was going to sail through this conversation. No, so here's, first of all, from the Chinese side. I think the pandemic has posed a real issue to everyone, not just to China. And I think pieces of the BRI will have to slow down and are slowing down, but it's not disappearing, right? To me, the biggest issue that China faces is, and by the way, I applaud the infrastructure vision that Xi Jinping has put forward. It's something like the moonshot, which inspired Americans to do great things. I think he's inspiring his Chinese citizens to do great things. But I think the big issue for them is, how does one in a country like China build infrastructure through some 100 countries, Central Asia, East Europe, Africa, with all these cultures, all these languages, all these sensitivities? How does China adjust to that? Right, as an example, the issue with Xinjiang, the Muslim population in China. I mean, much of Central Asia, Mark, is Muslim. The marquee project of the BRI is Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Already there are people getting kidnapped, Chinese engineers, the Pakistani army. So those are the issues there. From an American point of view, here's a wild blue sky idea. Why don't we say, hey, listen, China, you have this expertise in technology, infrastructure technology. You and I work on the biggest project you can dream of, infrastructure in the US. Come on in. We've got all these Wall Street asset management firms that have raised big, infrastructure funds,
Sure.
right? We need infrastructure. So we want to employ Americans, but you have the technology, we have the money. So let's do it. Let's do a big thing. And Mr. Xi Jinping can say, look how well it succeeded. We'll get infrastructure, and maybe it'll thaw things out, right? Another area along the same lines, again, BRI, is that China wants to become a big player in the peacekeeping United Nations forces area. As you know, the American Army is an expert at handling pandemics. At the Ebola crisis, we built a hospital in Africa. So why not the two militaries work together on this? So that's where I am with BRI and what I think we ought to be doing, instead of constantly harping on this competition. So I want to give you a chance to knock some sense in my head, and then we'll start winding down. We're running to the end.
Yeah, sure. I think that many Americans think that China takes all of our good ideas, steals our technology, but I think the BRI was really a U.S. initiative, and I really talk about it in my book about political economy of tomorrow. When the U.S. At late 19th century, early 20th century, there's a guy who used to work at the same bank I did for many years called Brown Brothers, and he said that the problem, 1865, 1900, half those years in the U.S. were crises. And he said the problem was that we had this congestion of capital. We needed to export it. And he suggested a global infrastructure, not portfolio investment like my friends do, buying bonds and stocks in other countries, but actually building, like you say, infrastructure, highways, ports,
yes.
Bridges.
Yes.
And this was a solution that this guy Charles Conant proposed that the U.S. should do. And I sort of think that that's what the U.S. did do.
Yes, we did, didn't we?
Through things like the Panama Canal,
yes.
for example. But I do think that China is in some ways wrestling with the same issues the U.S. had. at an earlier time in our development. And that's really an important point. I think people sort of compare the US and China as if they're at the same place in their development, and they're nowhere close. Even now, China per capita GDP is so much less than the US.
Yes.
China is still a very poor country. It's large, like India, large countries, but still relatively poor. And I think that the Belt Road Initiative, I think, is partly a solution of China's own problems, but I think it also runs into greater difficulty. So I would expect, along the same lines you're suggesting, is for China to sort of BRI 2.0, where it would consolidate and focus really on Asia, where it can benefit from the trade flows in a way that doesn't really from say, Africa. But I do think that this is going to be an exciting, challenging time, but I kind of think it's, look, the U.S. can't even agree with the Europeans about the space for two aircraft manufacturers, Airbus and Boeing. We can't agree on a lot of definitions of things. And I just think that I wish that the U.S. could cooperate with China on the ways that you're suggesting, but I'm afraid that it's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen, I think, is just that I think that the U.S. has decided that China is its big rival. And I think that China also sees little reason to cooperate with the U.S. because it also sees history on its side. It thinks that it's the rising power and the U.S. is a decadent, declining power. Already, China has more, more trading partners than the U.S. has as a number one, counterpart. So I think that both sides are fully embracing the competition, and China thinks that history is on its side, and I think the U.S. thinks that entrepreneurship, ingenuity, and sort of the capitalism, the sort of more market-driven capitalism, is on America's side.
And let me just end by saying I totally agree with you. I think it's time for China to say, we can't be viewing the United States as our grandfathers did, and for America to say, hey, we can't be viewing China as our grandfathers did. And
no, I want them to. I want them to. In 1900, the European powers and Japan were carving out China. The U.S. defended China's territorial integrity. We wanted to compete for the whole thing, while Germany was getting the Bundesdistrict and UK was getting Hong Kong. I think the U.S. and China fought on the same sides in both wars. I think that it's only the new generation that is confronting China like this. And it's sort of partly it's a bit like Dao Xiaoping used to say that you can't to quietly rise. And now I think President Xi says something like, you can't hide an elephant behind a tree.
So isn't it great that Xi Jinping, and whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, are going to be of a certain age, and the young people will go in the background, right? Listen, Mr. Chandler, I really do appreciate your joining us on this premiere edition of Polaris-Live. And before you go, let the election go by, and then let's come together and see if we can pick up this conversation, if you'd be agreeable, okay? And
that'd be very good.
My thanks for this great conversation, and we always have forthright ways of talking, which is what I love. So stay well, stay safe, talk to you soon.